All right, they left me a bottle and a half of water, which means they assume that I'm going to do a lot of heavy lifting, but luckily most of the real heavy lifting has already been done. So I'll be talking a little bit about the legacies of Wissenschaft des Judentums, and a little bit about the material culture and how maybe the one or the other can be intertwined. But before I get going, I would like to emphasize that for me, in many ways, the question of legacies are partly about the past, as we might, rightly would assume, but very much about the future. And so this is going to be one of the kind of recurring themes throughout my talk. I also think that legacies are different from, let's say, an inheritance. A legacy, if we, sorry to fall back on the German, is ein Vermächtnis. It was something that has been handed over with a task to be carried onward, whereas inheritance is something that we more passively receive. Then to think about legacies within a historical context, in my mind, implies most often a hope for a continuation, renewal, or even a return. Legacies articulate either desires for better futures inspired by the past, or impose upon the present and future a kind of continuation of the past. But how are the legacies of the Wissenschaft des Judentums and of the Hochschule relevant for us and our futures? And here I would like to emphasize something which is possibly quite obvious, but nonetheless, I think, really relevant. We can only inherit what has remained. That even the material culture, and we heard now quite a bit about this in the wonderful panel that preceded this, that exists today are remains of all of that which has been lost. So in many ways, our archive that has come down to us is obviously not a complete one. Many of these things exist either by sheer chance or because of concerted efforts by individuals, organizations, and institutions that, however, are also shaped very much by the Holocaust, as well as the ideas of rebuilding or not rebuilding after the war. Therefore, in many ways, also the very field itself out of which Wissenschaft emerged, the kind of German historicism, in many ways, I would reference it as a kind of form of imperial formation, meaning one that continues to exert its own power even beyond its original formation. To cite Laura Stoller, imperial formations are a form of register that is ongoing in its quality of processes of dissemination, displacement, and reclamation. Imperial formations are relations of force. They harbor political forms that endure beyond the formal exclusion. They legislate against equal opportunity, commensurate dignities, and so on and so forth. So I would say that in many ways, the force of the Holocaust in lots of ways continues to exert its force upon us even far beyond 45, as well as the very notion of what constitutes history and our ability maybe to write about history. So I'll talk first a little bit about the material culture, though after the last panel I'm slightly intimidated, so I'm going to go fast on that one, and then go from there a little bit into what I call the historicity or Geschichtlichkeit of Wissenschaft. I mean, we have to recognize that Wissenschaft introduced a historical way of thinking about the past, but history itself marked also very much Wissenschaft itself in the ways in which it governed its own ideas. Well, let me start with the shorter and more embarrassing part, and that is the material cultures. Today, the books that once belonged to the Hochschule have meanings as objects. They continually assert their presence as simultaneously material force and symbol, and we saw some of that. Simply the stamps themselves have a certain power beyond their kind of physicality. Artifacts like these, just like this building itself, and you said it earlier at the opening, exert a certain presence upon us and are part of what we could call a kind of reflective nostalgia. They're debris or remnants of violence, not objects of longing, but of fear, and hold traces of dissociated, dislocated, and often destroyed lives. I mean, obviously very clearly done in this building, where at every part you see what actually had been there before, but also the distance in many ways that separates us from them. They are therefore the remains of the destruction and of the ruination of European Jewry. So Leo Baeck's Aus 3 Jahrtausenden, from 3 millennia, combines much of his previous work for the purpose of being a guide in the challenging times of the Hitler regime, and the book was published in 1938. Most of the content of the book, though, had already appeared between 1914 and 1935 in various journals and books. 9 chapters alone had been published in the famous Monatsschrift, no less, and we already heard about it. The longest essay, Romantic Religion, had originally appeared in the Festschrift on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. Baeck's description of Judaism, with its emphasis on reason and ethics, is cast from the perspective of Immanuel Kant and Hermann Cohen. Judaism, the classical religion, stands in opposition to Christianity, the romantic religion, which seeks its goals in the new mythical, now mystical vision of the imagination. To be a believer in a romantic religion is to kind of prioritize mood and feeling or experience, Erfahrung, rather than morality and ethics. For all futures here, there's a very clear separation, in other words, between Protestantism and Judaism on the other side. Christianity, Baeck writes, employed mystical sacramental rites to bring heaven down to earth, while Judaism attempted to raise human conduct to the level of the divine, and therefore emphasized commandments and social obligations, or put differently, prioritized ethics. Christianity was concerned with salvation and experiences, Judaism with social morality and discussion. And this in many ways adds right on to the previous discussion that much of the scholarship coming out of Hochschule was really about these ideas of essence rather than a kind of more detailed history in and of itself. Interestingly enough, Baeck's deliberations, published in 1922, align with Ismar Elbogen's description that we've also already heard of the task of Wissenschaft on the 50th anniversary, where Elbogen asserted that while Wissenschaft was no longer subservient to theology, the final ultimate goal of Wissenschaft was nonetheless, and he quoted the ending part of this, was there to overcome hatred and bridge differences, though set within the context of the immediate post-war situation of the Weimar Republic. Now, interestingly, and I was trying to get at that earlier with my question, Elbogen used the occasion of the anniversary also of Etwas zur rabbinischen Literatur from 1818 in 1918 to reflect on the history of Wissenschaft, to assert its task in purely objective and scientific manner. Quoting Zunz left, right, and wherever he could, he's trying to align himself very much with that heritage of Zunz and the prestige that Zunz embodies as a kind of founder, but also where the silence are there marks very much the departure that I think is part of what Hochschule had become at this point. He saw, therefore, a need for a Jewish philosophy that aimed to legitimize the idea of a Jewish theology, something that Zunz would not have been particularly fond of, to say the least. Going a bit further was Sigmund Maybaum, leading faculty member of the Hochschule, who saw the exclusion of Wissenschaft from German universities, the other point, as a big advantage. The Hochschule therefore had its task to train rabbis and to uphold the revelation of Judaism. The anniversary, therefore, of the Hochschule, the 50th anniversary, in many ways continued the debate that had begun 50 years earlier with the foundation of the Hochschule itself. The scholarly debate and theological reflections were part and parcel of the tradition of Wissenschaft des Judentums and had already shaped the opening of the Hochschule itself. For Philippson, the opening of the Hochschule in 1871 was an instrument of cultural continuation and a renewal, a place of historical rebirth, one that, however, would have to be mindful of the religious traditions. Philippson wanted to see the Hochschule as a new center of research, and therefore the opening of the Hochschule was both a festive occasion as well as a critical moment that firmly cemented the internal divisions of Jewish scholarship. And we heard some of that earlier in the presentations in terms of the lines that are drawn and not drawn. Therefore, the opening of the Hochschule was also marked by the absence of Leopold Zunz. He purposely refrained from attending this very momentous moment as a way of very clearly illustrating that he did not want to be associated with the Hochschule. So therefore, these kind of debates about the nature of Hochschule and its research had been part and parcel right from the beginning and continued well into the 20th century. But it's probably fair to say that the earlier hopes associated Hochschule with historical research like Philipson had intended ultimately gave way, I think, to more and more research that was intended rather to focus on the religious kind of philosophy or theology of sorts. Yet, and this is, I think, important, whether we travel up to down to 1872 or up to 1918 or to 1922, all of these various reviews of the beginnings of Wissenschaft and of the history of Jews served to reassure a future. There was consolation and reassurance, and very clear reassurance that came from the past that spoke eloquently about the presence of a future. Baeck's book, though, was banned shortly after it was republished, was published in 1938. Most of the readers today read actually a 1959 republication of the book by the Leo Baeck Institute. Introduced by Liebeschütz, the opening pages situate the text carefully within the intellectual and cultural currents of the 19th and 20th century, with, however, only very briefly touching on the history of the Holocaust. I mean, Liebeschütz just barely references the banning of the book and then moves straight on to 19th century and 20th century intellectual history of Harnack and so on and so forth. But the wider context is really not significant for him. What is interesting here is also, we had that quote about the Monatsschrift, I think in one of the earlier presentations, the exchange between Elbogen and Leo Baeck. April 1939, Baeck writes that he hopes this to be the final issue of the Monatsschrift, and there may be somewhere to be a rebirth. So in terms of future anticipation or hopes, there's still a glimmer there, but there's also a sense of it being a finite moment now as far as the scholarship in Germany is concerned, Jewish scholarship is concerned. Well, I think things get now interesting, and now, bear with me on the material history of sorts, is to think about this book and the existence there of being very few copies of the original 1938 publications that still exist. The copy in Berlin, and most of you will know this, in the Jewish Museum is inscribed with a handwritten note, Wolfgang Hamburger, 12th März 1942. Hamburger was a child of a Jewish father and a Protestant mother who had studied at the Hochschule until it was closed. He survived the Holocaust. The closure of the Hochschule therefore, is really the end also in many ways of its libraries. And while other libraries had been successfully transferred out of Nazi Germany, meaning in particular the Warburg Library and the Wiener Library, that was not going to be the case for the library of the Hochschule, despite some attempts to kind of still make it happen. After the war, Leo Baeck tried to intervene when it came to this question of the kind of restitution of Jewish libraries, to possibly see the Hochschule, the remnant of the Hochschule library, go to England, but neither Saulo Baron nor Gershom Scholem were particularly fond of that idea and thought of Jewish life both in England as well as in Europe being far too transient for any kind of idea of any kind of future that would hold again these remnants of these libraries. And therefore, in many of the ways, that did not happen. The Cultural Assets website, I think one of you used it earlier today, tells us a couple of other interesting things. And we can here now, outside of the wider movement of this collection, understand something about the movement of individual books. And I think that's where it kind of gets interesting. There's a group of books that Anna, I think, had already published on, which ended up in Theresienstadt, and then ultimately were taken by the later Rabbi of Westphalia, Emil Davidovich. And those books ultimately ended up then in the Hochschule in Heidelberg. So we can kind of track them, right, from the Hochschule in Berlin to Theresienstadt to Prague, and then back to, or not back, actually to Heidelberg. But the question of the back is maybe precisely the question here. The creation of an institute in Berlin in 1963 also occasioned the introduction of various books that had been part of this looted art, and we can kind of track them as well. There's currently apparently a bigger project in place that is trying to kind of review over 5,000 books in their respective places of original, where they had originated from. Books of the Hochschule also are today at the Institut für die Geschichte der deutschen Juden in Hamburg, where there is also a project on the way to identify 200 books that overall are classified as also looted books from the Third Reich. Now, these individual books in many ways are small in number, maybe significant or not, but I think they are related to a bigger story, possibly of inheritance and hopes, and of new beginnings of new centers of Jewish studies in Berlin, Hamburg, and Heidelberg, as well as elsewhere. Their location evidences, on the one side, the ruptures and discontinuity, but at the same time, I think were created also deliberately to create new opportunities for a renewal. Now, what I think is telling that each one of these institutions in different ways became heavily invested originally into the study of the Jewish past, but not into the study of the Holocaust. And in my mind, it's really hard to study the one without the other, because whatever has come down to us, so to speak, comes filtered through the history of the Holocaust. The creation of the Heidelberg Hochschule was in many ways intended of sorts to be almost a successor to the Hochschule. Thus, the 40th anniversary of the Hochschule coincided with the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the Wissenschaft des Judentums. And some of us were actually in Heidelberg at the conference. Now, the call for papers acknowledged the dual anniversaries without, however, silencing the legacies of the Holocaust, and so therefore it's quite significant that there's at least this kind of acknowledgement when it said, while recalling the wreckage of the years between 1933 and 1945, the path from Wissenschaft des Judentums to Jewish studies as we know it today has often been read as a success story. To a great extent, however, this reading is also politically tried. Indeed, those looking closer would find that this merely fosters a narrative of complacency, which is ultimately dismissive of the unfinished rudiments, open questions, broken careers, and forgotten achievements, and so on and so forth. So in many ways, there was a sense that while celebrating both the anniversary of the Hochschule and the anniversary of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, that one had to consider also the history of the Holocaust. But I think the actual conference, at least that's my memory, proceeded pretty much like any other conference on the Wissenschaft des Judentums, meaning, you know, on the great ideas, on the Monatsschrift, or I lectured on secularizations. So in many ways, the promise of the call for paper ultimately was slightly less deliberate, and it became again a history that, quote unquote, was glorious in many ways, but was never quite connected to what ultimately happened to its practitioners. Now, our conference is even more clear in aiming to bring in both together, celebrating the legacy both of the Hochschule and to recall its destruction. This is the 1872, the 1942. This is important to the history of Wissenschaft, as it's also the history of its destruction in Germany, which, however, I would argue has not always been the case. Most often these fields separated and took distinct routes. One heavily invested in the history of the Jewish past, maybe the questions of emancipation and acceptance, on some level anti-Semitism, but most clearly not into the history of the Third Reich. And the other one, you know, treating really the history of the Jews as a kind of simple prehistory and the bigger story of the kind of rise of Hitler to power and then eventually to the Third Reich. But what remains, and I want to emphasize this again, this is to me the important part about these material cultures, what remains today in archives and libraries around the world is not only a legacy of scholarship, but a remembrance of its destruction. It marks actually an absence of a continuation. There's a kind of interesting question how we could study actually the absence of something. There's a I don't know if you've read this. There's an interesting book by sociologist Avery Gordon that talks about the haunting of things that are marking us still very clearly, but marking us by their respective absence rather than by their presence. So we can kind of think about this a little bit more. So let me now come to the kind of historicity, so to speak, die Geschichtlichkeit of Wissenschaft des Judentums. And I know there's something that we have to recognize when we look at that photo, and I kind of jokingly said something about the overwhelming presence of women in the photo of the Hochschule in 1938. There's something that, you know, situates that picture in a particular moment in time, and it's probably equally true that our moment in time is very far away from that one. So let me therefore kind of talk about the kind of historicity in a different way, and recognize that in many ways, Wissenschaft des Judentums is now more than 200 years old and emerged out of a particular moment intimately intertwined with the struggles for emancipation, religious reform, and cultural renewal. I would argue that our situation today is very different than when Zunz initially laid out his plan in 1818. I think our situation today is very different from 1918, 1922, and so on and so forth. But I think what, you know, distinguishes us is I think our own sense of time in terms of how we think about history, possibly our own way of understanding what signifies history, but also our own futures. I think that's, you know, probably in the end one of the most significant differences, and I'll come back to this. But let me emphasize the importance of this historicity. Historical studies emphasizes that everything is subject to time and space. There's nothing that we can look at that it's not marked by its time and space in which it was existed. Outside, obviously, and Leo Strauss made that point, its own historicity. So one of the charges that Leo Strauss brought against historical thinking was that it never recognized its own historicity, meaning that it too was created at a particular point in time. But suffices to say that at the end of the 18th century, German enlighteners introduced ideas like change and progress into political vocabulary, which made all of these ideas of enlightenment and others to become transformative. Words from the Enlightenment political vocabulary such as Bürger, Bildung, and Aufklärung describe processes that were meant to go forward. And in that respect, Dom and others applied that same insight also to the Jews, that they too possibly could be the recipient of Bildung and Aufklärung, and therefore also be subject to change. Enlightened politics, therefore, became translated into agendas of change, and historical study placed now, very importantly, the present into a critical pathway toward a better future. So in many ways, it's not coincidental that Zunz and his friends came to it when they do, which is right after the Congress of Vienna, when they're really in this in-between period. Emancipation had been partly granted once under Napoleon, now it's revoked again, and they're trying really to situate now this new moment in time on the kind of edge in terms of its proximity toward the anticipated future of emancipation. So it's really propelled by this thickness of this moment and its heightened anticipation. Therefore, then, Zunz introduced in a very radical manner a new idea, and that was to unite now all texts under a single description of historical sources. Nothing any longer stood above. Everything ultimately became a historical source. There was no elevated revelation or anything. Everything simply became a source of study. Thus, every historical datum that diligence has discovered, he wrote, astuteness deciphered, philosophy utilized, and taste put in its proper place, becomes a contribution to the knowledge of man, which is the most worthy goal of all research. I would though argue that Zunz's idea of history was encyclopedic. The more the merrier. In other words, it was a kind of sense of completeness that he was trying to achieve, rather than any kind of linear kind of idea of progress toward a more refined version. I mean, he subscribes to some idea to enlightened politics and has a preference for some kind of purer, as he deems a pure version of Judaism than maybe others, but ultimately his goal is really more encyclopedic than anything. So the historical operation then not only tell that there are all these sources, but that all these sources had to go through a rigorous process of study and source criticism, and that therefore ultimately nothing stood beyond it. Now this is the radical proposition of Zunz in 1818, one of those that by the 1870s, by the foundation of the Hochschule, has lost a lot of its appeal. Zunz and Steinschneider, in my mind, become the outsiders, whereas the major institutions, whether it's Breslau or indeed the Hochschule, see, and strive more toward a mixture of the sacred and the secular, and don't see them so much at odds with each other. And I think that's most clearly the sense as we move forward into the 20th century. Therefore, already in the fin de siècle, the future seemed somehow also more absent to many of these thinkers. And so whereas Zunz, thought about the future as being fulfilled within the next 5 or 10 years, and so did Jost, that future gets more and more distant the further you move into the 19th century, because he anticipated future doesn't seem to arrive so readily, meaning emancipation and full acceptance. But it's clear that therefore by the turn of the century in the fin de siècle, conceptions of the Jewish past are now increasingly relying also on what David Myers many years ago had called the anti-historicist argument, meaning identifying Jews and their history not so much in the flow of history any longer, Zunz, Steinschneider and others, or even Gratz, but seeing it more as identified by what one could call a sense or Wissen or something like that, Leo Baeck being one of them. But there are versions of that. Rosenzweig famously placed Judaism outside of history, and he was by far not the only one. But a lot of the kind of early 20th century Jewish thinkers kind of equally placed now Judaism outside of the kind of realms of history. Now, a lot of this had to do, I think, and became even further accentuated with the experience of the First World War, which in many ways was devastating to many. And I'm just using here one quote from Benjamin, of course, the storyteller. With the First World War, a process began to become apparent, which has not halted since then. A generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar now stood under the open sky in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged. In other words, any kind of certainty that may have existed, from Benjamin's perspective, is now entirely gone and taken away. Obviously something that in his own mind would become even more accentuated as he goes through the 20s, and then obviously more clearly reflects in his writings in the 1930s. So therefore then, in my mind, the question of the legacy of Wissenschaft des Judentums more widely and the Hochschule is not a question about the past, but about the very possible futures. Legacies of the past are intimately intertwined with our futures, as Rainer Koselleck and others have noticed. In the post-war period, ideas of rebuilding were paramount to the new German Republic and to the communities of survivors of the Holocaust. But I would argue that the centers of remembrance and the study around the Leo Baeck Institutes, and we just talked about the 3 of them, were concerned about the past and not the future. So this kind of shifting of the grounds that had already begun earlier in lots of ways reaches an altogether new height in the immediate post-war period, where, to say it again, I would argue that neither Jerusalem, nor London, nor New York was initially concerned about renewal as much as remembrance. And also, from its beginning, I would say, the ideas of rescuing of artifacts and archives and libraries that we talked about was also an act of remembrance. Established in 1943, the Conference on the Restoration in London with Cecil Roth called upon allies and others to assist in the rescue of these collections. These residues, these remains, comprise a great part of what is left of the Monumenta Judaica of the continent of Europe. So this is an archive of a bygone age, but not any longer anything that would continue to exist. To be sure, he did not rule out an ultimately renewal, but saw it as a far distance where it may seem dead, may ultimately be revived. but really without any kind of clear expectation as to where this would happen. Now, he was by far not the only one, but Leo Salo Baron, I did it earlier to him already, Salo Baron, and Hannah Arendt and everyone else who chimed into these discussions thought not just of Germany, but really of Europe as being far too transient, as I said it earlier, to be a place of any kind of renewal or a new beginning. So legacies then, in my mind, in this immediate post-war period, really had one larger problem, and that was they had no future, and acted mostly as a form of remembrance. In the cases where they were associated with a form of rebuilding and renewal of Jewish scholarship, like it was the case in Hamburg and Heidelberg and Berlin, they did it most often by dissociating their line of research very clearly from any kind of Holocaust-related considerations, which I think would have disturbed always the history of remembrance. I mean, remember that the Leo Baeck Institute really stays clear of anything, post-33 for the better part of its first decades in terms of its own research. Even though early on there may have been still debates. I mean, Leo Baeck was one of the few kind of more hopeful voices, but I would argue that he ultimately lost ground against Robert Welch in the kind of deliberations that led up to the creation of the Leo Baeck Institute. So put differently then, unlike the traditions of Wissenschaft and of Hochschule, the work of the LBI was no longer associating their task with any kind of idea of rebuilding. It's maybe a little bit exaggerated, but it's late in the day, and I want to make sure that I bring this out clearly. And the way in which I think this becomes really clear is, again, if we go back to Liebeschutz's own introduction into Baeck's book that I now used a couple of times, Aus 3 Jahrtausenden, where even conceptually, he doesn't even consider the potential implications of Baeck's interpretation of Christianity, which Michael Meyer draws out much more recently, and that is that there is this idea that this form of Protestantism that Baeck describes is devoid really of the preeminence of morality, and has an ability to void, in particular, its own political consciousness, and venerates really the cult of the individual. Meaning we don't have to work particularly hard to see how that may or may not, in lots of ways contribute to the rise of the Third Reich. But that's not what Liebeschutz considers, even not from the perspective of looking back when he writes his introduction. So let me now turn to a couple of, so to make it clear, I think the legacies therefore are really the legacies of an uncertain future. And I think even today, in my mind, I don't think we have yet defined really what that future could look like. But let me now toward some smaller kind of consideration toward the end. So thinking about these legacies at the beginning of the 21st century, I think also has to recognize that our own sense of what we're doing as, Wissenschaftler or as university professors has also more markedly changed. Much of that optimism that had propelled the 18th and possibly still the 19th century is probably a little harder to find right now. We're less thinking about us being on the cusp of solving all our earthly problems rather than on the exact opposite. We also are very clearly aware of the fact that our own social positioning, our own intersectionality, our gender, our class, our ethnicity shapes in every moment each of the things that we say. So therefore, this once venerated status of a Universitätsprofessor and this kind of importance that came with it and the assurance that came with it is probably for good reasons gone. And it's very clearly a debate in the United States, but I talked just briefly in the break about the Humboldt Forum and its various collections. It's a debate that is also clearly at the forefront here. So there's something that is very different about us as well right now that we bring to bear. But there is also, I think, on the other side, something else to bring to bear, and that is to say how much of this Wissenschaft scholarship, how much of its reconstruction of the Jewish past was actually shaped in a counter-image to Hegel, Droysen, Mommsen, and Harnack, and so on and so forth. So how much of this history has to continue to be written really out of this polemical exchange that had governed much of its scholarship? And how much is it relevant to us today or not? Probably not so much, I would argue. Or at least has been maybe replaced by other ideas. More, that was a good catch. I'm just getting dangerous here, this equipment, but I'll stay with it. More clearly otherwise, the idea of a unified and linear history, the concept of progress measured in technological and economic ways, has become really problematic. So this whole vision that has propelled the history of Wissenschaft, the history that it was telling us, is kind of forward-moving history of progress, of advancement, I think is really hard for us to kind of identify with right now. I mean, we're in many ways probably slightly closer to a slightly more catastrophic way of telling our past. Moreover, we have to recognize that the history as it was created also had inherent biases right from the beginning. The idea of the universal was never empty, but was always, humanity was always modeled on a white male figure. There was never any concerns about it being anything else. When the Enlighteners talked about men, they had a pretty good sense of what they had in mind. Most clearly not Jews, most clearly not women, most clearly not slaves. So in lots of ways, these ideals that had propelled this maybe are a little bit more difficult to kind of continue. But even in other ways, as Sebastian Conrad wrote, history as an academic discipline was exported from Europe to non-European countries in the process of imperialist expansion itself. That taught history to non-Europeans in a way that made them think as being temporarily always behind. So anyone who was not European was always kind of behind schedule, so to speak. And the group that also always was behind schedule from that perspective, obviously, were the Jews. So in many ways, there's much to be said about Wissenschaft and its scholarship and its historical reconstruction, but I think there's also much to be said about the critics of historical scholarship, whether it was Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, or indeed Leo Baeck himself. Let me just jump a little bit further here. So where does that leave us now? We ought to consider now, last but not least, I think, our own historicity and our own anticipated futures. And I want to kind of end with this a little bit. And we also have to consider other kind of models of time in history that maybe allow us to kind of think about 1942 and 1872 like we do in the course of this conference, which however means that we're simultaneously working forward from the foundation, but also working backward again from 1942 onwards. But therefore, it tells you something about how old I am, that my movie references come from the 1980s. Wings of Desire, a Berlin movie, gives us an interesting example of another way of thinking about time and history insofar as the different layers coexist and are overlayering in the movie itself. They are not in a linear kind of structure, but in lots of ways, as one moves through the movie, one moves through different layers of time. And history itself is actually precisely what's not attainable. If we listen to one of the wonderful characters in that movie, Marion, who at some point says, einfach sagen können, wie jetzt gerade, ich bin vergnügt, ich habe eine Geschichte und ich werde weiter eine haben. That is the unfulfilled dream, that in a history that is so thick and so layered, to have a history is actually precisely what is not attainable. So, but what does that now mean for us in our kind of wonderful new digital time of sorts at the beginning of the 20th century? So the recent digitizing age has often been heralded, and we just heard the beautiful reconstruction of a library, the access, the downloads, and the kind of accessibility. Much of this, one could say, has been a process by which old information has been transformed into new media, but it's essentially the same information, but more readily available, not in paper, but as PDFs. What it has yet not quite done, but will continue to be the case, it hasn't quite yet transformed necessarily the ways in which we engage with it. Whether I am sitting in the archive, it's maybe a question of preference or convenience, or at my desk and I'm downloading PDFs, I'm kind of accessing presumably the same information. But much, I think, of what comes now forward will possibly be far more radical and far more transformative. And I want us here to think about two thinkers that one of them I already indirectly had mentioned, and that's Reinhard Koselleck, who kind of introduced these ideas about realms of experience and horizons of expectations. Now, one of the kind of powerful parts of Koselleck's interpretation was that he was able to situate individual change in terms of society, productions, so societal changes in time, together with changes in the philosophies of history. In other words, his concepts were able to scale up and down as to how the life of a farmer changed and how we made sense of the past at the universities. And I think the same holds true for Stephen Kern's Fin de Siècle study, The Culture of Time and Space, where Kern argues that a series of sweeping changes in technology and culture created distinctive new modes of thinking about experiencing time and space. In other words, where technological innovations, telegraph being one of them, also result in new philosophies of time, Henry Bergson on the other side, or Heidegger. In other words, there's the assumption that the kind of bare bone experiences of our lives, the introduction of standard time and so on and so forth, would also have resulted in new philosophies of history. Karen therefore maintains that the sense of the present was distinctly new, thickened temporarily with retentions and pretensions of past and future. Now, there are many others that I could cite on this kind of time-space compression that has really created this new realization that in many ways our time has once more been compressed really to a single moment, and that is the single moment of the present. And one of those that I think stands out as an individual that we can cite here is actually Benedict Anderson's 1983 Imagined Communities, where he argued that actually for the creation of the nation state, a new concept of a kind of homogeneous time had to be created. But in the kind of the significance of this is explained by Anderson in a footnote where he writes, so deep lying is in this new idea that one could argue that every essential modern conception is based on the conception of meanwhile now. That what exists as time is not any longer past, present, and future, but really this meanwhile, or what we could otherwise call the now, or what we call the life, or the real life, or any of these versions. So my point being here is that whether we look at Koselleck, or Schivelbusch, or David Harvey, or Stephen Kern, any of those, they all have emphasized that the changes in technology dramatically affected the ways in which we thought about history. And that's the simple connection. And the ways in which we thought about history in terms of past, present, and future. And now I would argue that in many ways the change that Kern associates with the period from the 1880s to 1918 is probably far less significant than the change that we have just experienced from, let's say, 1989 to 2022. That in lots of ways we're now really in a moment where I think for various reasons this kind of idea of history and its progress has come to an end, and historicity may indeed define now slightly something in a different way. If we go with Hermann Marcuse, it defines history as something that is opposite from nature, but not really any longer this kind of triumphalist, linear, advancing progression in time. And I think with that, we arrive really where Leo Baeck had been all along in 1922, having been critical of history all along when he wrote, "History understands the past as closed. Geschichte sees it as moving into the future. Legacies are not part of history, but only of possible futures, not Geschichte, but maybe Geschichten of the future. Thank you very much.